The $17 million penthouse felt like a tomb at 3 in the morning. Victoria Sterling stood frozen in her marble hallway, designer heels dangling from her fingers, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. Rhythmic tapping echoed from her 8-year-old son's bedroom. Not the chaotic banging that usually meant another meltdown, but something different. Something that sounded almost like conversation. She crept toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, because in 8 years of desperate hope and crushing disappointment, Marcus had never spoken a single word to anyone. Yet somehow, impossibly, she could hear 2 distinct patterns of sound coming from his room. One she recognized as her son's stimming, and another that seemed to be responding, teaching, communicating in a language she'd never bothered to learn. Victoria pressed her ear against the mahogany door, her breath catching as she deciphered what was happening inside. Her son Marcus, diagnosed with severe autism at age 3, was making purposeful sounds, not the wordless vocalizations that usually filled their silent penthouse, but deliberate rhythmic taps and hums that followed a clear pattern. And responding to him was a deeper voice, patient and warm, creating an intricate dialogue in a language without words. The CEO of Sterling Dynamics, worth $4.3 billion according to Forbes, felt smaller than she had since childhood as she realized a stranger understood her son better than she ever had. Through the crack under the door, she could see shadows moving in the amber glow of Marcus's nightlight. 2 figures sitting cross-legged on the floor, engaged in what looked like the most natural conversation in the world. 6 hours earlier, David Chen had begun his shift, the way he had for the past 2 years at Sterling Tower. At 34, he moved through the gleaming offices with quiet efficiency, emptying trash bins and restocking supplies while the city's financial elite worked late into the night. His daughter Sophie often asked why he cleaned buildings when he had 2 engineering degrees from MIT, and David always gave her the same answer. Honest work was nothing to be ashamed of, and sometimes life required starting over. David wore his janitor's uniform with the same pride he'd once worn his army fatigues. Both represented service, duty, and the responsibility to protect what mattered. The Sterling Tower contract paid well enough to cover Sophie's private school tuition and their modest apartment in Queens, and that was all that mattered now. The executives who worked in these offices never looked at him directly, never wondered about the man behind the cleaning cart. David preferred it that way. Invisibility meant safety for him and Sophie. What they didn't know was that David Chen had once been Captain David Chen, United States Army Corps of Engineers, until an IED in Afghanistan took his hearing in his right ear and his confidence. In loud, chaotic environments, the disability discharge had ended his military career, but not his need to serve. Now he served in smaller ways, quieter ways, while raising his 8-year-old daughter alone, since her mother's death from cancer 3 years ago. Tonight felt different from the moment David stepped off the elevator on the 72nd floor. Usually the executive levels were empty by midnight, but lights blazed in the corner office suite that belonged to Victoria Sterling herself. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, David could see the silhouette of a woman pacing frantically while speaking into a phone, her free hand gesturing with sharp, angry movements. As David approached with his cart, fragments of conversation drifted through the partially open door. "I don't care what it costs, Dr. Martinez. I need you here tonight. Marcus had another episode and Mrs. Chen quit. That's the 4th nanny this month. I can't do this anymore." David slowed his movements, recognizing the raw desperation in her voice. He'd heard that same tone from other parents in the special needs community. The exhaustion of fighting a system that didn't understand, the isolation of loving a child the world saw as broken. "No, Mother, I will not consider residential care. He's my son, not a problem to be hidden away." Victoria's voice cracked with exhaustion. I built a billion-dollar company from nothing. Surely I can figure out how to help my own child. The phone clattered onto the desk. Through the open door, David watched Victoria Sterling, the woman who commanded boardrooms and intimidated competitors, sink into her chair and bury her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. David had been cleaning offices long enough to know when to disappear, when to pretend he hadn't witnessed private moments of vulnerability. But something about this scene stopped him. Maybe it was the desperation in her voice. Maybe it was the mention of a child named Marcus. Or maybe it was the military training that had taught him to recognize when someone needed backup, even if they were too proud to ask for it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He knocked softly on the doorframe. Victoria's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face transforming instantly into a mask of cold professionalism. The cleaning can wait, she said sharply, turning away to hide her red eyes. I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am, David said quietly, his voice carrying the steady calm he'd used to diffuse tensions in combat zones. I couldn't help overhearing. I have some experience with children who have special needs. If there's anything I can do to help. Victoria whirled around, her executive armor fully restored. You're the janitor. I hardly think you're qualified to... She stopped mid-sentence, something in David's steady gaze making her reconsider. What kind of experience? David stepped into the office, moving slowly, non-threateningly. My daughter has ADHD and processing delays. I've learned a few things about alternative communication methods. Sometimes kids just need someone who speaks their language. Marcus doesn't speak any language, Victoria said bitterly. He's 8 years old and he's never said a single word. The doctors say he may never... Her voice broke again. May I ask what happened tonight? Victoria studied the man in the janitor's uniform, trying to reconcile his careful, respectful tone with his position. The nanny was trying to get him ready for bed. Marcus became overwhelmed. They call it a meltdown, and he started hitting himself. Mrs. Chen couldn't calm him down, so she quit, via text message, while my son was still screaming. David nodded slowly. Overstimulation. It's like a fire alarm going off in their nervous system. They're not being defiant. They're in genuine distress. Something in Victoria's expression shifted. This janitor was using clinical language, speaking with the authority of experience rather than offering empty platitudes. How do you know that? Because I've been there. Different child, same helplessness. David paused. Where is Marcus now? In his room with his noise-canceling headphones. I gave him his tablet to calm down, but he'll be awake all night now. Tomorrow I have a board meeting, and I'm supposed to present the quarterly projections while running on no sleep because my son... She stopped herself, horrified by what she'd almost said. Because your son needs his mother, David finished gently, and you're doing the best you can. Victoria's carefully constructed walls cracked. This stranger had just offered her something no therapist, no specialist, no expensive consultant had ever given her, understanding without judgment. I should fire you for eavesdropping, she whispered. Yes, ma'am, you probably should. So why are you still here? David met her eyes steadily. Because sometimes when you're drowning, you don't care if the person throwing you a life preserver is wearing the right uniform. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Then Victoria made a decision that would change everything. His room is on the residential floor, 85th level, if you think you can help. She pulled out her phone. I'll disable the security locks. The residential floors of Sterling Tower were a different world entirely, where the office levels showcased power and success. The private living spaces revealed the hollow loneliness of extreme wealth. Marble floors stretched beneath coffered ceilings. Original Monet paintings hung on walls that rarely hosted visitors. Every surface gleamed with perfection, but nothing felt lived in, loved, or warm. David followed Victoria down a hallway lined with closed doors, guest suites that never housed guests, studies that went unstudied, rooms that existed only to fill space in a home too large for the two people who lived there. At the end of the hall, light seeped beneath a door decorated with a small nameplate. Marcus. Victoria hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. He doesn't like strangers. He might react badly. That's okay, David said softly. I'm not here to change anything, just to listen. When the door opened, David's first impression was of organized chaos. The room was large but felt safe, filled with soft textures and muted colors. Weighted blankets lay draped over beanbag chairs. Fidget toys were organized in clear containers along the walls. A sound machine hummed in the corner, providing white noise. And in the center of it all, sitting cross-legged on a thick rug, was a small boy with dark hair and his mother's intelligent brown eyes. Marcus Sterling wore noise-canceling headphones and clutched a tablet displaying a video of rain falling on leaves. He rocked slightly, his free hand tapping a complex rhythm against his thigh. His face was still flushed from crying, but his breathing had steadied. "Marcus," Victoria said softly, "this is Mr. Chen." He wanted to say hello. The boy didn't look up, didn't acknowledge their presence. He continued his rhythmic movements, lost in his own world. David studied the child for a moment, noting the way Marcus's finger tapping followed the rhythm of the raindrops on his screen. Then, very slowly, David sat down on the floor about 6 feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't try to make eye contact. He simply existed in the space, breathing quietly, letting Marcus become accustomed to his presence. After several minutes, David began to tap his own fingers against his knee, matching Marcus's rhythm exactly. The boy's movement slowed slightly, but he didn't look up. David maintained the rhythm for another minute, then gradually shifted it, making it more complex, more musical. It was a technique he'd learned from Sophie's music therapist, using mirroring to create connection before attempting communication. Marcus's rocking stopped, his head tilted slightly as if he was listening to something new and interesting. David shifted the rhythm again, this time incorporating elements of the rainfall sounds from Marcus's tablet. The tapping became a conversation between the rain, the boy's original pattern, and David's gentle additions. And then, impossibly, Marcus began to tap back, not randomly but purposefully, adding his own variations to the rhythm David had created. Victoria's sharp intake of breath from the doorway was barely audible, but David heard it. He was witnessing something unprecedented. Marcus Sterling was engaging in reciprocal communication. For 20 minutes, they continued their wordless conversation. David introduced new patterns, and Marcus responded with his own innovations. The boy's posture gradually relaxed. His breathing deepened. When he finally looked up from his tablet, his eyes found David's face. Marcus pulled off his noise-canceling headphones and set them carefully beside him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, but clear as crystal, he spoke his first words. "More music." The tablet slipped from Victoria's nerveless fingers, clattering against the marble floor. In 8 years of specialists, therapies, and interventions, no one had ever reached her son. No one had ever made him feel safe enough to bridge the gap between his world and theirs. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. "More music," David repeated softly, his own voice thick with emotion. "I think we can do that." As the rhythm between them resumed, now enhanced by Marcus's quiet humming, Victoria Sterling realized she was witnessing a miracle. Not the kind of miracle she'd prayed for, her son suddenly becoming normal, but something far more profound. She was seeing her child as he truly was. Not broken, not deficient, but beautifully, perfectly himself. And she was seeing a janitor reveal himself to be something far more complex than his uniform suggested. This quiet man who emptied her trash cans had just given her son the one thing her billions couldn't buy: genuine understanding. In the soft glow of Marcus's nightlight, 3 lives intersected at a moment that would change everything. Victoria Sterling was about to learn that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words, and David Chen was about to discover that serving others could take forms he'd never imagined. The music between father and son, both lost and found, continued into the night, creating a bridge between worlds that seemed impossible to span. But some miracles don't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they begin with nothing more than a man willing to listen and a child brave enough to trust. Victoria Sterling stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows the next morning, watching the sun rise over Manhattan, while her coffee grew cold in her hands. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Marcus's voice again. More music? 2 simple words that had shattered 8 years of medical certainties and expensive failures. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from her assistant, board members, and the usual parade of people who needed decisions only she could make. Sterling Dynamics wouldn't run itself, but for the first time in her adult life, Victoria found herself unable to focus on quarterly projections and market analyses. All she could think about was the quiet man in the janitor's uniform, who had accomplished in 20 minutes what teams of specialists couldn't achieve in years. She'd Googled David Chen the moment he left, expecting to find nothing more than basic employment records. Instead, she'd discovered fragments of a far more complex story: military service records that were heavily redacted, an MIT alumni directory listing him as a graduate of both mechanical and biomedical engineering programs, a single newspaper article from 3 years ago about a young widow named Sarah Chen, survived by her husband David and daughter Sophie, age 5. The pieces didn't fit the picture she'd constructed. Janitors didn't have engineering degrees from MIT. They didn't speak with the clinical precision of trained therapists. They didn't carry themselves with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, which raised the question that had kept her awake all night. Who was David Chen, really? Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his pajamas, his tablet clutched against his chest. He looked at Victoria with eyes that seemed clearer than they had in months. More present. Without his usual morning meltdown, without the chaos of trying to force him through his rigid routine, he simply stood there, waiting. "Good morning, sweetheart," Victoria said softly, setting down her coffee. "Did you sleep well?" Marcus nodded, then did something unprecedented. He walked to the kitchen island where Victoria kept a wooden fruit bowl and began tapping out the rhythm from the night before. The same complex pattern David had created, now reproduced perfectly from memory. Victoria's throat tightened. "You remember the music?" Another nod. Marcus continued tapping, his eyes fixed on his mother's face with an intensity that took her breath away. He was trying to communicate something, reaching across the divide that had separated them for so long. Would you like to see Mr. Chen again?" she asked carefully. Marcus's face lit up with the closest thing to a smile she'd seen in months. He ran to his communication board, a tablet loaded with picture symbols, and rapidly selected images. Music note, happy face, more. Then he looked at Victoria expectantly. For 8 years, she'd built walls around her son's autism, treating it like a fortress to be conquered, rather than a different way of experiencing the world. But watching Marcus express genuine excitement about connecting with someone, Victoria realized she'd been fighting the wrong battle entirely. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to David's contact information. Her finger hovered over the call button. What exactly did she plan to say? That she wanted to hire him as Marcus's therapist, that she needed him to explain how he'd broken through when no one else could, that she was terrified of losing the tiny miracle he'd created. Before she could second-guess herself, she pressed call. David's phone rang as he was making breakfast in his small Queens apartment. Sophie sat at their kitchen table, working through her summer math workbook with the focused determination she'd inherited from her mother. Their morning routine was precisely choreographed after 3 years of single parenthood: cereal and orange juice, reviewing yesterday's homework, checking that Sophie's inhaler was in her backpack, confirming pickup plans for after her art camp. He almost didn't answer the unfamiliar number, but something made him pick up. "Hello? Mr. Chen, this is Victoria Sterling from last night." David glanced at Sophie, who looked up with curious eyes. "Good morning, Miss Sterling. Is everything all right? Is Marcus okay?" He's different today. Calmer. He remembered what you did last night, the rhythm patterns. He's asking for more music." Victoria's voice carried wonder and confusion in equal measure. "I was wondering if you might be available to see him again. Tonight, perhaps?" David set down his spatula, thinking quickly. His shift at Sterling Tower didn't start until 10 p.m., and Sophie would be at her grandmother's for the evening. "I could come by around 7 if that works for you." "Yes, thank you." Victoria paused. "Mr. Chen, I have to ask, your background, your knowledge about autism and communication methods, it seems unusual for someone in your current profession." David had been expecting this conversation. Victoria Sterling hadn't built a billion-dollar company without developing strong instincts about people. "People's stories are rarely as simple as they appear, Ms. Sterling. I'll see you at 7. After hanging up, David found Sophie watching him with the perceptive gaze that sometimes made him forget she was only 8 years old. "Was that about work, Daddy?" "Something like that, sweetheart. I might need to help someone tonight." Sophie nodded seriously. Since her mother's death, she'd become accustomed to her father's various jobs and volunteer commitments. David worked maintenance shifts, tutored neighborhood kids in math, and helped other military veterans navigate disability services. Sophie understood that helping people was simply what they did. "Is it someone with special needs like Tommy?" she asked, referring to a boy in her art camp who had Down syndrome. "Yes, something like that. A little boy who needs someone to understand his language." Sophie brightened. "Like how you learned sign language for Mrs. Rodriguez when her grandson visits." David smiled. His daughter had grown up watching him adapt to communicate with people others often overlooked. She'd seen him learn basic Spanish for their building superintendent, practice sign language with their neighbor's deaf grandson, and research sensory processing techniques when her friend's brother struggled with overwhelming environments. To Sophie, these weren't extraordinary acts of service. They were simply how her father moved through the world. "Exactly like that, baby girl." Victoria spent the day rearranging her schedule with surgical precision. She postponed 2 board meetings, delegated the quarterly review to her CFO, and cleared her evening completely. Her assistant, Margaret, couldn't hide her bewilderment. "Ma'am, the Carlson merger requires your immediate attention. They're threatening to walk if we don't respond by tomorrow." "Then let them walk," Victoria said absently, reviewing research papers about autism and alternative communication methods on her computer screen. "Sterling Dynamics survived before Carlson and will survive after." Margaret stared at her boss with undisguised shock. Victoria Sterling didn't postpone merger negotiations for anything. She'd once conducted a board meeting via video call from a hospital room while recovering from appendix surgery. Now she was treating multi-million-dollar deals as minor inconveniences. "Should I reschedule your dinner with Senator Morrison? It's regarding the federal contracts." "Yes, reschedule everything for the rest of the week." "The entire week, ma'am?" Victoria looked up from her computer screen where she'd been reading about something called stimming and its role in autistic children's self-regulation. "Margaret, in 8 years, have you ever known me to repeat myself?" "No, ma'am. I'll handle the rescheduling." As Margaret left, Victoria returned to her research with the same intensity she once brought to hostile takeovers. She read about sensory processing differences, about the way autistic children experienced sound and touch and social interaction. She learned that what doctors had labeled as Marcus's behavioral problems were actually his nervous system's attempts to cope with overwhelming stimuli. Most importantly, she discovered that the rhythmic tapping David had used wasn't random intuition. It was a recognized technique called rhythmic synchrony, used by music therapists to establish connection with non-verbal children, which meant David Chen hadn't just gotten lucky. He'd known exactly what he was doing. By 6 p.m., Victoria had compiled a list of questions that would have made a congressional oversight committee proud. She was going to learn everything about David Chen's background, his methods, and most crucially, how to help her son continue progressing. Marcus had spent the day in his room, not withdrawn and isolated as usual, but engaged in purposeful activity. Victoria found him arranging his toy cars in complex patterns, creating visual rhythms that echoed the musical ones from the night before. When she knocked on his door, he looked up immediately and smiled. Actually, smiled before returning to his arrangements. For the first time in 8 years, Victoria allowed herself to hope. David arrived at Sterling Tower at exactly 7 p.m., wearing civilian clothes that somehow made him look more distinguished rather than less. Without his janitor's uniform, the military bearing was more apparent. The straight posture, the economical movements, the way his eyes automatically cataloged exits and potential security concerns. Victoria met him in the lobby herself, a gesture that had the building's security team exchanging puzzled glances. In all their years of employment, they'd never seen Ms. Sterling personally greet anyone below executive level. "Mr. Chen, thank you for coming." "Of course. How has Marcus been today?" As they rode the elevator to the residential floors, Victoria found herself studying this enigmatic man more carefully. His clothes were clean but inexpensive, chosen for function over fashion. His hands bore the calluses of manual labor, but his vocabulary and bearing suggested education and authority. The contradictions multiplied the more she observed. "He's been different," Victoria said as they walked toward Marcus's room. "Calmer, more engaged. He's been creating patterns with his toys, almost like he's practicing what you taught him." "That's good. Repetition helps integrate new skills. Children with autism often need to process experiences multiple times before they feel safe incorporating them into their routine." Again, the clinical precision of his language struck her. "You speak like someone with formal training." David paused outside Marcus's door. "Ms. Sterling, before we go in, I need to be clear about something. I'm not a therapist. I can't cure Marcus's autism, and I wouldn't want to. What I can do is help you understand his communication style and build on the connection we started last night. But this isn't a medical intervention." "Then what is it?" "It's one parent helping another find a way to reach their child." The simple honesty of his answer disarmed her completely. Victoria had grown so accustomed to corporate doublespeak and medical jargon that David's straightforward approach felt revolutionary. Marcus was waiting for them, sitting in the center of his rug with a selection of musical instruments arranged around him. a small keyboard, a set of wooden blocks, and several percussion instruments Victoria had bought years ago but never seen him use. When David entered the room, Marcus's face lit up with recognition and joy. Without hesitation, he began tapping out the previous night's rhythm on the wooden blocks, looking expectantly at David to join him. "He's been practicing," Victoria whispered. David sat cross-legged on the floor, accepting the drumsticks Marcus offered him. "Hello, Marcus. I see you've been making music." What followed was 45 minutes of the most sophisticated conversation Victoria had ever witnessed her son have. They communicated entirely through rhythm and sound, building complex musical dialogues that incorporated call and response variations, and even what appeared to be musical jokes that made Marcus giggle, a sound Victoria hadn't heard in months. David didn't just play along with Marcus's patterns. He challenged him, introduced new concepts, and gradually expanded the boy's musical vocabulary. When Marcus became overstimulated, David seamlessly shifted to simpler rhythms that helped him regulate. When Marcus showed excitement about a particular sound, David explored it further, following the child's interests rather than imposing his own agenda. "How do you know what he needs?" Victoria asked during a quiet moment when Marcus was absorbed in arranging his instruments by size and tone. "I watch. I listen, not just to sounds, but to body language, breathing patterns, energy levels. Marcus tells me everything I need to know. I just have to pay attention to how he communicates. The doctors say he's nonverbal." The doctors are wrong. Marcus is incredibly verbal. He just doesn't use spoken words as his primary language. Listen to the complexity of what he's creating. That's sophisticated communication. As if to prove David's point, Marcus began playing a melody on his keyboard, then looked directly at Victoria and patted the floor beside him. "An invitation." Victoria hesitated. "I don't know how to—" "Just follow his lead," David encouraged. "He'll teach you." Tentatively, Victoria sat beside her son. Marcus handed her a pair of maracas and played a simple rhythm. When Victoria attempted to match it, he nodded encouragingly and gradually made it more complex. For the first time in 8 years, mother and son were engaged in genuine, joyful communication. Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she realized what she'd been missing all these years. Not a broken child who needed fixing, but a brilliant, creative, loving boy who simply spoke a different language than she did. And David Chen, this mysterious janitor with the gentle hands and infinite patience, wasn't just teaching Marcus music. He was teaching Victoria how to love her son exactly as he was. As the evening wound down, Marcus approached David with his tablet and pointed to a new symbol he'd never used before, a picture labeled "Friend." David smiled and gently tapped the screen, accepting the designation. "I'm honored to be your friend, Marcus." Marcus then turned to Victoria and with great deliberation selected another symbol, "Happy." "He's happy," Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. "He's telling me he's happy." David watched mother and son share this moment of connection and felt his own throat tighten with emotion. This was why he'd really left his engineering career behind. Not because of his disability discharge, but because he'd discovered something far more valuable than building structures. He'd learned to build bridges between hearts. "Same time tomorrow?" Victoria asked as they prepared to leave. "If Marcus wants that, then yes. And Mr. Chen, I'd like to discuss compensation for your time." David shook his head firmly. "This isn't about money, Ms. Sterling. This is about helping a little boy find his voice and a mother rediscover her son. Some things are too important to put a price on." As David left the building, Victoria remained in Marcus's room, watching her son arrange his instruments for tomorrow's session. She thought about the board meetings she'd postponed, the merger negotiations she'd delayed, the dozen ways her absence from Sterling Dynamics would cost the company money. She didn't care about any of it. For the first time in 8 years, her son had looked directly at her and chosen to share his joy. That was worth more than every billion in her portfolio. Tomorrow she would learn more about David Chen's mysterious background. Tonight she would sit with her son and practice the new language he was teaching her, the language of music, patience, and unconditional acceptance. In the quiet of Marcus's room, with only the soft hum of his white noise machine for company, Victoria Sterling began to understand that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a single moment of genuine human connection, and sometimes the people who change our lives forever arrive wearing janitors' uniforms and carrying nothing but an open heart. 3 weeks had transformed the Sterling penthouse from a sterile showcase into something resembling an actual home. Musical instruments occupied corners where priceless sculptures once stood. Marcus's artwork, vibrant patterns that reflected his unique way of seeing rhythm and color, decorated the refrigerator alongside Victoria's business awards. The sound of laughter, rare for 8 years, now echoed through rooms that had known only silence. Victoria found herself leaving work earlier each day, something her board of directors noticed with growing concern. The woman who once conducted conference calls during family dinners now turned off her phone completely when David arrived for his evening sessions with Marcus. She'd even started working from home on Fridays just to spend more time learning her son's musical language. This particular Thursday evening felt different from the moment David stepped off the elevator. Marcus had been agitated all day, not his usual meltdown behavior, but a focused anxiety that Victoria couldn't interpret. He kept pointing to the window, signing words David had taught him: danger and protect. "He's been like this since this morning," Victoria explained as they walked toward Marcus's room. "I can't figure out what's bothering him." David paused in the hallway, his military training picking up subtle details Victoria had missed. The building's ambient sounds were different tonight. More security chatter in the lobby, additional elevator activity, the kind of increased vigilance that suggested heightened alert status. "Has anything changed in your business recently? Any new threats or security concerns?" Victoria's expression darkened. "There's always something. Corporate espionage, hostile takeover attempts, disgruntled investors. I stopped paying attention to most of it years ago." She paused. "Although Richard Morrison has been particularly aggressive lately about acquiring Sterling Dynamics, but that's just business." David's instincts, honed by years of combat and parenthood, told him this wasn't just business. Children with autism often possessed heightened sensitivity to environmental changes. Marcus might be picking up on threats the adults hadn't yet recognized. They found Marcus in his room, not engaged in his usual musical play, but standing at his window with his tablet, repeatedly typing and deleting the same message. When he saw David, he ran over and showed him the screen. "Bad men coming. Daddy David, stay." The hair on the back of David's neck stood up. In 3 weeks of sessions, Marcus had never shown fear like this. The boy's intuition about people and situations had proven remarkably accurate. If he sensed danger, David wasn't going to dismiss it. "Victoria, I need you to call building security and ask about any unusual activity tonight. Now." Something in David's tone made her comply without question. As she made the call, David knelt beside Marcus and began the calming rhythm patterns they'd developed, but the boy remained agitated, continuously signing danger and pointing toward the elevator banks. Victoria's face went pale as she hung up the phone. "Security says there's been unusual surveillance activity around the building for the past 3 days. They've also noticed unauthorized attempts to access the building's digital systems." David's military training kicked into high gear. "Pack a bag, both of you. We're leaving, now." I'm not abandoning my home because of some vague security concerns. Victoria. David's voice carried the command authority he'd once used in combat zones. Your son is telling us there's immediate danger, and every instinct I have is confirming it. We can argue about it later, but right now, we need to move. As if summoned by their conversation, Victoria's phone buzzed with an emergency alert from her head of security. Credible threat detected. Evacuate immediately. Do not use main elevators. The color drained from Victoria's face. Oh, God! Marcus knew. David was already moving, his protective instincts taking over. Service elevator to the parking garage. My truck is parked on level B3. Move. But as they rushed toward the service elevator, the building's lights flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Through the windows, they could see black SUVs surrounding the building's exits. The stairwells, David said grimly. It's our only option. Victoria grabbed her purse and Marcus's emergency bag. Medication, noise-canceling headphones, his comfort tablet. Marcus clung to David's hand, no longer agitated but focused with the intensity of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. Daddy, David, protect, Marcus said clearly, his voice stronger than Victoria had ever heard it. Marcus, help. They made it to the 42nd floor before David heard footsteps in the stairwell below. Too many people moving too quickly with the coordinated precision of a tactical team. Not building security. Something else entirely. David pulled Victoria and Marcus into an empty office, pressing them against the wall beside the door. How many stairwells in this building? 4, 2 on each side. They'll have all of them covered. David's mind raced through tactical options, hampered by the fact that he was protecting civilians, including a child with special needs who couldn't handle sudden changes or loud noises. Is there another way down? Victoria thought frantically. The freight elevator in the north wing, it's manually operated, doesn't depend on the main power grid, but we'd have to cross the entire floor to reach it. Then that's what we do. The journey across the darkened office floor felt like a military operation. David moved point, using hand signals Victoria didn't understand, but Marcus somehow did. The boy stayed close and quiet, his trust in Daddy David absolute. They were halfway across the floor when Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We have your building surrounded. Surrender Victoria Sterling or face the consequences. Morrison, Victoria breathed. He's not trying to buy my company. He's trying to steal it. David didn't waste time on corporate politics. The elevator, now. They reached the freight elevator just as the stairwell doors burst open behind them. Voices echoed through the darkness, professional, coordinated, closing in fast. David yanked open the manual elevator controls as flashlight beams swept the office behind them. Get in, now. The ancient freight elevator creaked to life, descending with agonizing slowness as sounds of pursuit grew closer. Marcus pressed against David's side, no longer afraid, but determined, as if he understood that his family was under attack and that David was their protector. 20 more floors, Victoria whispered, watching the floor numbers tick by with painful slowness. That's when David's phone rang, Sophie's number. His blood turned to ice. Sophie was supposed to be safe at her grandmother's house in Queens. She should have been asleep hours ago. Daddy. Sophie's voice was small, terrified, but trying to be brave. There are men here. They say they need to talk to you about your work. Grandma's crying. What should I do? David's world contracted to a single burning point of rage and terror. They'd taken his daughter. They'd threatened the one person in the world he'd sworn to protect above all else. Sophie, baby, listen to me carefully. Go to Grandma's bedroom and lock the door. Remember the safe word we practiced? Tell the men that Daddy will trade himself for you, but only if they prove you're safe first." Victoria watched David's face transform as he spoke to his daughter, seeing something she'd never witnessed before. A father's absolute love transmuted into lethal protective fury. This wasn't the gentle janitor who taught her son music. This was someone far more dangerous. "Who is this?" A harsh voice took over Sophie's phone. "You know who I am," David said quietly, his voice carrying a level of controlled violence that made Victoria step back involuntarily. "And you know what I'm capable of. You have something of mine. I have something of yours. Let's discuss terms." Captain David Chen, formerly of the Army Corps of Engineers, currently employed as custodial staff at Sterling Tower. "We've done our research. You want your daughter back? Deliver Victoria Sterling to the parking garage in 10 minutes. Come alone." The line went dead. In the silence that followed, Victoria finally understood. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" David's eyes, when he looked at her, held depths she'd never seen before. Military training, combat experience, and beneath it all, the fierce love of a father willing to do anything to protect his child. "I was Captain David Chen, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. I spent 8 years defusing bombs in Afghanistan before an IED took my hearing and ended my career. The engineering degrees were military-sponsored education. The therapy knowledge came from 3 years of helping Sophie process her mother's death." He paused. "And yes, I've killed people, more than I care to count, all to protect innocents like you and your son." Victoria absorbed this revelation as the elevator finally reached the parking garage level. Everything made sense now. The calm under pressure, the protective instincts, the way he could read situations and people with surgical precision. "You're going to trade me for Sophie," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to get my daughter back. Then I'm going to deal with the men who threatened her." "And Marcus and me?" David looked at the boy who had called him Daddy David, who trusted him absolutely, who represented everything pure and innocent in a world that had shown David too much darkness. "I don't abandon my family." Marcus tugged on David's shirt and began signing rapidly. Words David had taught him, but arranged in ways that showed sophisticated understanding. Victoria couldn't follow it all, but she caught key concepts. Protect, together, trust, family. David knelt to Marcus's level and signed back, his hands steady despite the circumstances. Then he turned to Victoria. "Marcus has a plan. It's dangerous, but it might work." David's expression was grim but determined. "He wants to help save Sophie. He's asking if we trust him enough to let him." Victoria looked at her 8-year-old son, the boy she'd once thought was too fragile for the world, too vulnerable to contribute anything meaningful, and saw something she'd never noticed before. Strength, intelligence, courage. "What kind of plan?" Marcus pulled out his tablet and began typing rapidly, his fingers flying over the keys with purpose and determination. When he showed them the screen, Victoria's breath caught. Her son had typed out a detailed tactical assessment of the building's layout, security vulnerabilities, and optimal positioning for a coordinated response. It was the work of someone who had been observing and analyzing their environment with the precision of a military strategist. "He's been watching," David said with something like awe. "All this time he's been learning, analyzing, understanding everything around him. He knows this building better than anyone." Marcus typed another message. "Bad men think Marcus broken. Marcus not broken. Marcus protect family too." Victoria knelt beside her son, this remarkable child she was only beginning to understand. "Marcus, sweetheart, this is very dangerous." Marcus looked at her with eyes that held absolute determination and signed clearly, "Daddy David, protect Sophie." Marcus, protect mama. Family protects family. In that moment, Victoria Sterling realized that her son wasn't the one who needed fixing. She was. She'd spent 8 years seeing limitation where there was capability, disability where there was different ability, weakness where there was strength beyond measure. "Tell me the plan," she said. As David outlined Marcus's strategy, using the boy's encyclopedic knowledge of the building's systems and his ability to move through spaces unnoticed, Victoria felt something shift inside her. For the first time in her adult life, she was part of something bigger than corporate success or financial achievement. She was part of a family worth fighting for. The elevator opened onto the parking garage, where shadows and danger waited. But Victoria Sterling was no longer the same woman who had hired David Chen to clean her offices. She was a mother ready to trust her son's brilliant mind, a woman ready to follow a warrior's lead, and a human being ready to discover what she was truly capable of when everything she loved was on the line. "Let's bring Sophie home," she said. Marcus signed one final message that made David's eyes fill with tears. "Sophie is Marcus's sister now. Nobody hurts Marcus's sister." As they stepped into the darkness of the parking garage, three unlikely allies prepared to face whatever waited in the shadows. A billionaire CEO ready to risk everything for family, a disabled veteran with nothing left to lose, and an 8-year-old boy with autism who was about to prove that the world had vastly underestimated what he was capable of. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. The rescue was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same.